Hope you're enjoying the episode so far. To learn more about Orakui as well as more information about our upcoming episodes, don't forget to follow our socials for constant updates and education content. Links are always in the description.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Insights with Experts. Joining us here today, we're very fortunate to have Mr. Jonathan Aberman. Now, Jonathan is the current Dean and Professor of Practice at the School of Business and Technology at Marymount University. Jonathan has over 30 years of experience as an expert in the intersecting fields of innovation, entrepreneurship, policies, and over the course of his journey, he's dipped in toes in many different fields, such as venture capitalism, law, trading, investment banking, entrepreneurship, and I'm sure the list just keeps going on and on. But I'm not going to spoil that because I'm sure we're going to learn all about it here in this interview. Jonathan, it is absolutely wonderful to have you here today with us. Thank you so much for joining us. How are things all the way over on the other end of the world in Washington?
Well, at the moment, we're walking around upside down. And thanks to gravity, we're staying on the Earth. So 3 cheers for that. Things here in D.C. And in the United States generally, as you know, are I would say it's a time of real challenge and turmoil in a lot of ways. You know, we're going through a lot of social dislocation because of COVID. It's raising a lot of issues around equity. What's the economy about? Obviously, it's very politicized right now. Even the virus and COVID has become politicized, and as a result, it's I haven't seen the United States like this, and I'm now dating myself a bit, but I haven't seen the United States like this since the '60s during the Vietnam War, and you know, it's a very interesting time. I'm sure we're going to talk about this from a standpoint of entrepreneurship. I don't think in my life I've ever seen more capital available for emerging businesses than there is right now. It's never been in some ways a better time to be an entrepreneur than right now, but it's also a very difficult time to be in society if you don't have those particular insights, which by the way is I think a worldwide issue. And I'm really glad to be on your show because I know you're trying to do something about that.
Absolutely. And Jonathan, so I'm going to get into the first question. And essentially what I think we all want to know is, can we just get an overview of your journey?
It's very funny. I think that when people tend to look at somebody's career, particularly somebody who's been at it for 30 or so years, it has a tendency to look like there's some sort of linear progression to a person's life. And the reality is that life is a random walk. And at best, you have some North Stars that are sort of long-term goals or things that drive you. And for me, I'm a third generation immigrant. My grandparents all immigrated to the United States from Eastern Europe. And my family supported themselves, my grandfather and my parents, by being entrepreneurs and owning their own businesses. And I grew up in that environment. My dad owned a fishery, catching fish and lobsters, and my mom owned an art gallery. So I grew up in this kind of environment of entrepreneurship. And it was very much, I think, sort of part of me. But my parents and grandparents were both really concerned that I should be what they were not, and I should be a successful professional. So they spent a lot of their money and effort to encourage me to do that. I ended up getting some very nice qualifications from English universities in law and economics, and started to work in the investment banking industry. And then I rose in the law industry, and I hit my late 30s, and I said, wait a minute, I want to own my own business like my parents and grandparents. And my family was absolutely horrified that I would have chosen that path, but I did, and that's how I started my first real business, which was Amplifier Ventures, the investment company that I started. And things progressed from there. I started investing in companies, and I've learned very quickly that when you have money, your jokes are funnier and your opinions are more interesting. And so VCs are in many ecosystems. I'm sure it's the same in Australia. I've seen it every place around the world. The VCs are generally at the center of the ecosystem of entrepreneurship. So that created opportunities for me to become a professor and started to teach. It allowed me to start advising politicians on policy matters. And ultimately, you look back after 30 years, and what started out as, gee, I think I'd like to be in charge of my own life, has resulted in me being a dean of a prominent private university here in the DC region. And it all made sense. against the template of I want to make a difference, I want to be in charge of my destiny, and I want to help create things. But I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that when I was 25, I knew that 35 years later, I was going to be talking with you today on this podcast from my office at Aberman University. I mean, I didn't have a clue. I just knew that I wanted to make a difference.
Right. It's quite clear you've always been an entrepreneur at heart. And then you
Absolutely.
said it was when you were 31, if I'm not wrong, when you started your first company. And with that, I wanted to ask, do you is 31, that seems to be like a rough age where many other people would start a company as well. And do you think, because many of the people watching this podcast might be significantly younger, might be students in universities and so on, and we're probably wondering, is there ever an age where it's too early to be an entrepreneur? Or do you think there's always an opportunity for anyone?
Well, I should expand it further and tell you I was close to 40 when I started Amplifier, so it makes the question, I think, even more apt. And I've worked with entrepreneurs of all ages in my life. I think that when people ask the question of when should I be an entrepreneur, they're almost missing the point. In the following thing, we have a tendency around the world to describe people as an entrepreneur as people who have started a startup, a tech startup primarily. The reality is, entrepreneur is a person who has the skills and the passion to get up every morning and challenge the status quo and have enough guts to say, I can make something different and I can create something that's valuable to somebody else. And the reality is that a startup is just one manifestation of that. For example, your podcast is an entrepreneurial activity. I don't know if you see it that way, but you woke up one day and said, I know people that I can benefit from. There are many people who don't. I want to fix that. Um, People who are running and developing great social ventures are entrepreneurs. Heck, people who run great clubs or great religious organizations are entrepreneurs. So when somebody says to me, what's the right age to be an entrepreneur? I almost feel like if you're asking that question, you probably aren't. Because if you are an entrepreneur, you're not asking me that question. The question you're asking me is, when should I start a business? And the answer to that is, you start a business when something bothers you so much that you can't stand it, and you think that you can provide a solution to that problem that nobody else can. And that is a deeply personal decision, and it's based upon what you know and where your competencies are. And that can happen when you're 16. That can happen when you're 50. I've seen it in all ranges. We just saw the United States. We just saw Jeff Bezos go up in space. He came back, and some people were pleased, some people were not. But he went with him an 82-year-old woman who wanted to be an astronaut and didn't get the chance. That's that kind of passion. You know what I mean? 82 years old, that kind of passion. So the answer it basically is, if you're asking me when you should be an entrepreneur, I don't think you're an entrepreneur. If you're asking me what are the conditions for when I should start an entrepreneurial activity, we can talk more about that. But it's not age specific, it's opportunity specific.
Right. And there's a very good quote that says, if you think you're too young to do something, then you're probably never going to do it at all.
That's
And with that as well, I want to stay on this whole topic of entrepreneurship, because the whole idea surrounding entrepreneurship, I mean, at least in my opinion, I would say is pretty subjective in terms of what makes a good entrepreneur, right? With that, how do you think you can measure the quality, I guess, or what you define as a good entrepreneur compared to, I guess, an entrepreneur who isn't as good? And I'm using very subjective
yeah.
terms here, but what would you say with that
Well,
concept?
I think it's important to point out that if you're talking about entrepreneurship in the realm of a startup, I've seen, God, I'm going to describe in a moment what I think makes someone a good entrepreneur. I've seen bad entrepreneurs succeed. You can overcome being a quote bad entrepreneur. But if you're living in a life of probability, the bell curve, here are the characteristics that I see people tend to be most successful as entrepreneurs. And it all comes back to a few key things. The first one is if you talk with a psychiatrist about entrepreneurial behavior, and I have, and I've learned from them over the years, when we are young, I'm talking 3, 4, 5 years old, we actually develop most of the substrates of our personality. And one of the things we develop is something that's been described, and I describe as your winning personality trait. What do you do to get your way? And if we are honest about ourselves for a moment and think about when we were 4 or 5, we know there was something we did to get our way. It may have been having a temper tantrum. It may have been trying to reason with people, may have been going into a dark room and sulking. There was a winning strategy that worked for us. And absent any sort of psychological intervention, we repeat that strategy every time we're under stress. So if you look today at the CEO who's a bully, I bet you bottom dollar in nursery school or kindergarten, that person was beating the kid with a shovel during playtime. It's just the way it works. So winning strategy is number one. The most successful entrepreneurs know their winning strategy and understand it. Great example is Steve Jobs' career. Steve Jobs is a great example of somebody who had a particular winning strategy. Steve Jobs he was a bully. I mean, this is the way the world is. They called it his reality distortion field. And when he started Apple and grew Apple, he eventually outlived his welcome because he was so antagonistic, they threw him out of his own company.
Right.
And when he was wandering in the wilderness with Pixar and the other companies next, eventually they brought him back. And he had enough sense about himself to surround himself with people who had thick skins. And when he would get angry with them, would just shrug and walk out and say, well, that's just Steve, and then go back to work the next day. So Apple was hugely successful. So winning strategy. The second thing is, and it's very related, is that there are positive entrepreneurial characteristics like, self-starter, like optimism, energy, never having fear, that exist on the fine line between mental health and mental illness. So, for example, manic depressives are incredibly charismatic people when they're up, but when they're down, they can't function. Or a narcissist. Narcissists are incredibly charismatic, but they can never, ever modify their story and, in fact, change. Sociopaths are very manipulative because they don't care. So what happens is people who are dysfunctional and functional both become entrepreneurs. The difference is that people who are emotionally stable, when they face these crisis moments where their behavior patterns, their winning strategies don't work, they take a step back and say, wait a minute, I can't just yell at people. Or wait a minute, I can't just go in a room and think on my own. Or wait a minute, it's not all about me. In other words, they have self-awareness and they have empathy. They're able to see themselves and others, and they're able to adapt. So my conclusion and what I've seen consistently is, on probability, the most successful people, the most successful entrepreneurs are self-aware, have empathy, and understand their winning strategy. And what I found when I invested, and I'm investing, I guess, even now, either my money or time, I always look for people that have those characteristics. Why? Because as a coach, which is what an investor or a mentor is, you have to have people who are willing to listen and change their behavior. So, funnily enough, for those of you listening who are thinking, I want to get capital, believe it or not, when a VC or an investor does their due diligence, the biggest thing they're looking for is to see how you adapt and how coachable you are. The line that the VC industry often uses is, you bet the jockey, not the horse. And while it may seem like a lot of the due diligence is about your business, it really isn't. It's about you, to see how you deal with the stress of due diligence.
Right. And so I think so in that answer, we've quite clearly established what's a good entrepreneur, what's a bad entrepreneur. However, do you think, let's say if I'm a quote unquote bad entrepreneur, am I intrinsically going to be a bad entrepreneur, or is there room for me to grow and turn to that other side? And if so, how?
Welcome back to another episode of Insights with Experts, where we aim to encourage and foster discussion, learning, and creating an informed global community. To view this and other interviews in detail, head over to theseer.org, linked in the description. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our channel for constant updates. Enjoy the episode.
Well, so number one, I think that most entrepreneurs actually grow through failure. And if you look at somebody's career, mine included, I've had some pretty spectacular reversals. Funnily enough, they don't end up in the resume. But for example, when I started Amplifier Ventures, I had the fund completely raised until a key anchor investor pulled out, and it all went away. And it took me 18 months to raise another, to re-raise the money I had. I had to deal with that. So people learn through adversity, because what it does is it forces them to confront why they're failing. And this comes back to self-awareness and self-appreciation. You learn, and maybe you did nothing wrong, maybe you did something wrong. I describe it as failing to success. What do you learn? So, for example, you've got a product that you think is great. You do your beta, you send it out, and people don't want to buy it. So what do? You stop? Or do you go and say, well, what would you buy instead? The failing to success. So somebody who's a bad entrepreneur can become a good entrepreneur largely by learning from their mistakes, because nobody's career is linear. The other thing I'll tell you is I've seen really great entrepreneurs never really have big success, because success in some ways is luck. That's the dirty secret that people will not share in a lot of these podcasts and panels. They always make it seem like their success was assured. And that's not true. Everybody who has a huge $1 billion win or $100 million win had that moment where it could have gone one way to win another, and they were just stone cold lucky. So the only people who consistently fail, in my opinion, are people who are kind of doomed to fail because they don't learn. So that, and again, we're using good, bad. I almost feel a little bit bad about using that, because it almost makes it like I'm the final arbiter, which correct, and I don't want to use that term. I think a better way to describe it is on the probabilities. If you have these positive characteristics, or you can learn these positive characteristics, you're more likely to have a happy life that you enjoy being part of, that gives you control, and ultimately is successful. But it doesn't mean that you can have really negative characteristics and not succeed. I mean, some of the most successful CEOs in the world are stone cold sociopaths, and it doesn't matter, because they're in positions where they can just be the way they are and succeed. So I think it's important for people to know themselves, Sean. You know what I mean? You could probably tell I'm a big believer that what entrepreneurship is really about is self-determination. It's autonomy. That's why people are interested in it. Well, if you're going to do that, you have to own your stuff, right? You have to know yourself. And if you know yourself, then I think you're 3/4 of the way there.
It's through rolling up your sleeves, getting out into the real world, actually being in the action yourself, failing and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And I wanted to kind of get your take on that. Do you think that will inevitably be the case with entrepreneurship, or are there ways you can teach entrepreneurship through mentorship, through courses, through other kinds of things like that?
Well, I think it's a combination of the two. And so let me explain, first of all, I believe that you can't really develop your skills if entrepreneurial skills, developing entrepreneurial skills require that you try to work with others, manipulate others in a positive way to make something happen. And you can talk about it all day long, but until you develop those skills, you're not going to be an entrepreneurial character. A friend of mine described it best. When I was a venture capital lawyer, and I went to a friend of mine who was an investor, and I said, I'd like to be a VC. And he looked at me and said, you've done hundreds of venture deals as a lawyer, but you've never actually been a VC. You're not going to be a VC until you get into the boxing ring and get punched in the face, which I thought was a really graphic way to describe it. But, he's paraphrasing Mike Tyson, the famous boxer, who once growled at an opponent saying he had a plan to defeat Tyson, as Tyson growled and said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So I think that there is definitely, you got to get into the mix. What you can do as an educator or as a mentor is you can help people understand what winning characteristics they have, because so for example, I've seen really successful introverts who are just intensely analytical people and can really understand on a very granular level how their business models work and how to position their product, but could never go out and sell, right? So giving them the understanding that those skills are really great as long as they match up with somebody who maybe is more outgoing. So a mentor's job, an educator's job, is to help people understand what the tools are and how to develop them. It's the entrepreneur's job to then go off and get punched in the face. You follow me? The other thing you can teach is you can teach the structure and mechanics of starting a business. I mean, I teach, and you can teach which corporate form to use, what do the financing structures look like, how to build an organization, how to build a sales team. I mean, there are skills that are skills-based you can teach, but ultimately it's an experiential thing, right? It just absolutely is, which is why as an educator, we do things like internships. Big believer in internships, while we bring outsiders into the classroom to talk about experiences. But there's no substitute. If somebody wants to be an entrepreneur, and be a business entrepreneur. There's no substitute, frankly, for starting a business. You learn more starting a business and failing miserably than you're ever going to learn in a classroom if you really want to be an entrepreneur.
Now, on the topic of entrepreneurship, I think it'd be quite nice if we kind of talked about this in conjunction with the whole topic of innovation. You know, what I found quite interesting about innovation, I saw this article, and essentially what it said, it was from the National Science Foundation. And what they're suggesting is that as a whole, innovation has been slowing down over time. It's actually currently lower than it was 100 years ago. And I just wanted to get your take on this whole notion, because I would imagine, first of all, measuring innovation is quite a subjective thing. Do you think innovation has been slowing down? And if so, if not, what's your whole reasoning behind it?
Well, I think first of all, we need to unpack the term innovation, because the way that the NSF uses it, or the way a lot of tech people use it, they're really talking about innovations around areas of technology application that result in a product or a service that's uniquely different. And the reality is, innovation is a much broader term. Innovation means coming up with something new that currently doesn't exist, meaning that somebody who writes a dubstep tune and finds a new way to program a synth is being innovative, and somebody who draws a really great cubist design can be innovative. But let's be more narrow. You're asking a question about what I'll define as technology innovation. And I think that there are a couple of things going on here, or a number of things going on here, that are in fact causing the pace or the breadth of innovation to slow. The first one is, in a lot of ways, earth-shaking changes, new technologies are becoming harder and harder to do because the easy pickings have been had. If you go back 100 years, um, I guess if you go back 100 years, think about it. We didn't even have commercial aviation. We certainly didn't have jet airliners. We did not have anything close to understanding the atomic power, atomic weapons. We didn't understand genome. We didn't understand proteins. We didn't even have vaccines. I mean, the polio vaccine didn't exist. So I think that some people say, well, as the ability to do the truly new gets harder and harder because we push the horizon so far out in scientific discovery, that means that innovation has slowed. I don't think that it's slowed. I think it's become more incremental, because just physics, there's just a limit. Now, I do think that there are other factors at play which are harming innovation. One is monopolization. There is an unbelievable amount of monopolization and concentration in just about every industry that matters in the 21st century economy: transportation, energy, the internet, media. It's heavily consolidated. And when industries are consolidated, innovation is not rewarded. From the standpoint of disruptive innovation, is certainly not rewarded because people want to maintain the status quo. So we have that. The second thing is, frankly, we are in a political environment where there are good chunks of society in Western democracies and around the world now who are not the least bit interested in intellectual development. Just to be blunt, it's almost like we're coexisting with a medieval caste now that wants to go back before science. And that affects things. Education is affected. This debate, oh, should you go get a university degree? A lot of it is really based upon, sadly, not as much should you get an education in a different avenue so you can still be productive, but should you just stay stupid? And I really find that objectionable, honestly. So I think that people who talk about slowing innovation, when they run those three factors together, say, well, we have reasons to be concerned. My answer, frankly, is science hasn't stopped. If you look at what's happened with the epidemic and COVID, the mRNA vaccines are an exceptionally revolutionary thing, and they provide the potential for people in the next 5, 10 years to have cancer cured through an injection. I mean, it's actually going to happen. When that does, it's going to be a revolutionary change. I do think space technology, even though at the moment it's being driven by some very wealthy people, is ultimately going to change our economy. So I'm more optimistic, I think. And the last thing I'll say is climate. Climate's changing. And ultimately, that's going to result in a massive call to action. And I think in a lot of ways, climate and intellectual horsepower on climate is going to be the shadow industry, but the dominant industry in our economy in about 20 years worldwide, because it's going to have to be, because otherwise we're all going to die. So I'm not pessimistic on innovation, Sean. I just think that it's going through a period of time where it's harder to change the world in a big way.
Right. It's talking about innovation, inferring it's something that we want, right? Specifically talking about why it's good. However, I just wanted to shift over to maybe the negative things that come with innovation, things like creative destruction and so on.
Well, I think it's important, and you've touched on this, is that innovation, technology, is no different from a stick or a phone or whatever. It's a tool. And tools can be used to make life better. Tools can be used to make life worse. Look, we're in the middle right now of seeing an amazing scandal around the use of anti-terrorist spyware technology on phones being used against journalists. And the company's saying, "Hey, we just made the technology. We're not responsible." And I think that the answer is ultimately we all get to choose. If we're entrepreneurs and we say we value choice, well, the answer is you get to choose. You get to choose how to live your life. You get to choose what your values are and what you're in it for. You get to choose how to balance competition versus collaboration. You get to choose what a society is about. And there are many people, I think, that are telling our young people through message in the media that it is not up to you to choose. The choices have all been made. You are, my son's 26. He'll say sometimes, I feel like I'm screwed. That the world is just, there's nothing positive for my generation. And I think that has unfortunately been foisted upon your generation. It is not true. You are the largest demographic group in the world. If you choose to have, say, society value equity more, or if you choose to have society value climate responsibility more, or alternative energy or space exploration, you'll be able to drive, as long as the countries remain democratic, you'll be able to drive things. So what I tell my students is ultimately, this is about what you value. Now, without getting too deep into it, Marymount's an interesting university because it started out from a religious order, a religious Catholic order, that started out a couple hundred years ago in France around the idea of getting women out of poverty, working class women out of poverty, right? So the only choice they had was prostitution. So a bunch of nuns and the priest said, no, we have to change that. We have to educate. That's Marymount's history. So, me as a dean, I'm Jewish. My provost is Muslim. Our president's Catholic. Faculty are Protestant, Catholic, agnostic. Students are from the Middle East, Asia and so forth, United States. Why does it all work? It all works because everybody shares a common value of empathy and making society better for everyone. And I think that that's something that I tell my students, that technology without context is really dangerous. To your point, just because you can make something doesn't mean you should. Just because we can make an atomic weapon doesn't mean we should. Just because we can make a software that snoops on people doesn't mean we should. It's what you do with the technology that ultimately matters. And I think that's a personal choice or a societal choice. So that's what I try to do. I try, and we all do at Marymount. And frankly, when I taught at the universities, did the same thing. What are you about? What's important to you? What are you going to do while you're here on this planet that's going to nourish you and be responsible for others? In other words, do you want to be a citizen or do you want to be a taker? And I think that people should be encouraged to be citizens, because society, when we look at history, when people are citizens and they look at others and how will their actions affect others, you generally have more productive societies, they're more stable, more people are happy, and more people get out of poverty. It's shown consistently for the last 2,000 years of history. When those things come together, it's great what happens. And when they don't, it doesn't end well. It's just the way it is. So that's the big message. Be empowered, pay attention, be political, and understand that what matters is what's in your heart. You got to be a good person, I think.
If you could leave young people with just one piece of advice, what would that one piece of advice actually be?
I think the most important advice I can give you is to figure out what makes you happy as a person. And I mean that sincerely. I'm not talking about some, crystally, like useless, let's all burn incense together. I'm talking about what truly drives you, not what your parents tell you drives you, not what society tells you drives you, what truly drives you. Because, like I know from my own experience, when I figured that out, I became much happier and I became more successful. And ultimately, it ties to a great piece of advice I got, which I'll share with you. When I was leaving the law, I was a very successful venture capital lawyer, managing partner of a couple of law firms, big offices, very successful in all respects. I decided I want to start Amplifier Ventures. And I went to a friend of mine and asked to invest in my fund. And he was a very wealthy person, still a close friend. And he looked at me and said, "Why are you starting the fund?" And I looked at him, and I thought it was the stupidest question anybody ever asked me, right? And I looked at him, and he's a good friend, and I kind of said, "What are you talking about? Obviously, I'm starting the fund because I want to get rich." And he looked at me and he said, "That's completely the wrong answer." I said, "How can that be the wrong answer?" He said, "Listen, you can't control whether or not you're going to be rich in life. That is a function of luck. What you can control is whether or not you like the journey. If you are going to like being an entrepreneur, then you should do this. If you're not going to like the ups and downs and the ins and outs and all the mayhem, don't do it." And over the years, as I've had good years where I've done very well financially, years where I've lived off savings, times where I've had complete reversals, and times when it's been amazing, I've always remembered my friend's advice. And I realized 30 years later, he's absolutely right. I like myself. I like what I'm about. I'm in touch with it so that everything I do nourishes that. And that's something I would want for you and everybody in life, to be able to have that feeling.